The city stretched endlessly under a pale, clouded sky, its streets cracked and silent. Every building stood like a monument to something forgotten, their windows dark and hollow, doors hanging slightly ajar as if inviting a visitor who was never meant to arrive. The pavement was broken in places, weeds growing through the cracks, but there was no wind to disturb them. The silence pressed in from all sides, heavy and complete, broken only by distant echoes that seemed to come from nowhere. Streetlights stood frozen and bent, their glass shattered, swaying slightly though no breeze passed. It was a city alive with absence, as if every structure remembered the lives that once moved through it and waited for their return. As the first steps were taken along the empty avenues, the sound of shoes against the pavement seemed amplified, bouncing off walls and disappearing into deep silence. A faint haze hovered over the ground, diffusing the pale sunlight and making the buildings appear as if they were melting into the air. Occasionally, a shadow moved where it shouldn't, shifting along walls or across streets, stretching unnaturally before fading. Sometimes reflections appeared in the darkened windows, faint, delayed, slightly off from reality, showing streets that didn't exist, doors in impossible locations, and shapes that could not be identified. The city itself seemed aware of each movement, responding in subtle ways, rearranging, breathing, adjusting the path. Doorways opened and closed without touch, revealing long, narrow corridors inside buildings that defied expectation. The inside of one store appeared much larger than the outside would allow, a ceiling rising impossibly high and walls bending slightly in response to attention. A staircase formed where none should exist, then dissolved as focus shifted, leaving the observer to wonder if it had ever been there at all. Light behaved strangely, pooling in corners without source and flickering across broken tiles, while shadows moved independently of any illumination. Even objects shifted subtly. A sign tilted, a chair turned a fraction of a degree, and a piece of paper fluttered as though a gentle hand had moved it, though nothing could be seen. Every subtle motion was deliberate, yet it carried no threat, only the undeniable presence of the city itself, alive and attentive. The streets curved in impossible loops, leading back to points already passed, and yet each turn revealed new alleys, abandoned squares, and narrow lanes that seemed both familiar and foreign. Faint humming filled the air, vibrating through the empty streets and buildings, a sound too deep to trace, but strong enough to be felt in the chest. Occasional distant echoes, steps, soft thuds, or faint metallic creaks hinted at unseen movement, though nothing could be found. The city was a puzzle, an environment that shifted when unobserved, revealing only fragments of what it had been or might have been, each fragment increasing the sense of curiosity, unease, and awe. As the observer moved deeper, an open plaza appeared, lined with towers and wide stone walkways. The buildings seemed older here, the facades etched with marks and symbols whose origins were unclear. Light glimmered along rooftops in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, moving slowly as though following a rhythm. Reflections in puddles on the cracked stone showed not only the observer, but stretches of streets and buildings that did not exist in reality. Shadows here moved faster, curling and elongating across walls in ways that defied physics. Doors along the plaza opened suddenly, revealing interior spaces filled with subtle movements. Curtains swaying slightly, floors vibrating, lights pulsing faintly. The city was aware, responding to attention, guiding exploration with quiet precision, never threatening but impossible to ignore. Every turn, every street, every alleyway was alive with subtle cues. The air seemed thicker in some areas, colder in others. The observer noticed that the farther they ventured, the more the city's presence became tangible, a slow, deliberate pulse beneath the feet, in the walls, in the street itself. Objects appeared and disappeared. A rusted bicycle leaned against a building one moment and was gone the next. A bench shifted slightly, as if repositioned by invisible hands. Shadows converged and diverged along walls and streets, forming vague shapes that vanished when approached. The city's own rhythm seemed to dictate movement, guiding steps through spaces that stretched or contracted depending on attention. Light, shadow, and sound worked together to create a narrative of absence, of memory, of quiet life where nothing moved yet everything observed. At the center of the city, a large square opened, paved with worn stone and surrounded by tall buildings whose rooftops vanished into mist. The square appeared familiar yet impossible. One side of it curved unnaturally, forming a subtle loop that made navigation disorienting. Faint lights drifted along the edges of the square, illuminating doorways that led to interior spaces beyond comprehension. Some doorways revealed long halls, stretching further than reason would allow, with walls subtly moving in response to the observer's gaze. Others revealed open-air courtyards filled with fog that shifted without wind, creating shapes that hinted at movement, yet remained intangible. Every space told a story without words. Every shadow suggested life without presence. The square seemed to stretch farther than the eye could see, yet each step brought new, unexpected details into focus. Cracks in the stone widened slightly as though the city itself was exhaling beneath the feet. Faint whispers traveled along the empty streets, not voices, not words, but subtle vibrations that tickled the edges of perception. Sometimes the whispers followed movement, echoing softly when attention wandered, then fading the moment the focus returned. Puddles reflected not only the broken buildings, but stretches of sky and structures that could not exist, creating corridors of impossible space. The city's silence was deceptive. Every sound, no matter how small, was amplified, carrying an almost tactile weight. A tall building along the edge of the square had no apparent entrance, yet a faint outline of a doorway glimmered in the dim light. Approaching it revealed a smooth surface that shifted slightly under observation, as if testing whether to permit entry. When stepped closer, the outline became a real door, edges sharp and defined, inviting but not requiring passage. Inside, the space expanded impossibly, ceilings stretching high above, floors extending far beyond what the outside dimensions suggested. Shadows curled across walls independently of any light source, and the air carried a low hum, resonating in harmony with the heartbeat of the city itself. Moving through the hallways felt like moving through thought. Every step influenced the surroundings subtly, walls breathing, light bending, floors tilting just enough to make each movement feel consequential. In one hall, a stair appeared where none had been before, ascending in a gentle spiral. The steps pulsed softly with light, each glow synchronized to the faint hum filling the building. The staircase twisted upward, not steep but impossibly long, walls bending outward slightly as though granting passage while testing patience. Occasionally, a step would wobble slightly as if weightless, only to solidify when observed more carefully. Reaching the top, a corridor unfolded into an open-air balcony overlooking more streets of the abandoned city. The view was both familiar and alien. Streets looped impossibly, buildings stretched at odd angles, and shadows moved along rooftops as though alive. Floating lights drifted through the misty air, guiding attention, yet refusing to be followed directly. They danced and shifted, pulling curiosity forward while maintaining a careful distance. Returning to the streets, the abandoned city revealed new pathways, narrow alleys twisting around buildings that seemed taller than before. The air grew cooler here, the fog thickening just enough to blur the edges of vision. Every surface held subtle motion. Tiles shifted imperceptibly, walls breathed in slow rhythm, and shadows formed shapes that disappeared when looked at too closely. Occasionally, a faint creak or scrape would echo, suggesting movement where none was visible. Reflections in windows offered glimpses of streets that were not there, buildings curving in impossible geometry, staircases rising or falling in impossible ways. The city's logic was different. It operated by perception, memory, and presence rather than ordinary rules of space. Awareness was both compass and anchor, guiding exploration while maintaining a constant tension. A large building with an open courtyard appeared next. The courtyard was filled with mist, drifting like slow waves across the stone. Light glimmered from no discernible source, illuminating shapes that seemed to move at the periphery of vision. Occasionally, small objects, an overturned chair, a rusted bicycle, a weathered sign, shifted subtly, reacting to attention or movement, but never falling, never breaking. The courtyard seemed to have a rhythm of its own, expanding and contracting slightly as if breathing. Paths led outward into smaller alleys and side streets, each opening offering new possibilities, new shifts, new interactions. Every corner held potential for discovery. Every hallway seemed to twist unpredictably. Yet the observer was compelled forward by curiosity, by awe, and by the faint, steady pull of the city's awareness. A narrow alley led to a series of buildings that appeared older and more worn. The walls here were marked with faded patterns, symbols that seemed familiar without being identifiable. The fog thickened between structures, curling along the ground like slow-moving water. Shadows pooled in corners, stretching along walls, but no form emerged. Occasionally, faint glimmers appeared in broken windows, suggesting movement or life where none existed. The observer noticed that each time attention faltered, the city shifted subtly. A building would appear closer, a doorway would vanish, or a staircase would rise where none had been moments before. The abandoned city was alive, aware, interacting without words, communicating in rhythm, light, shadow, and movement rather than language. Returning to the central square, the observer found a tower that rose above all surrounding buildings. Its edges were faintly illuminated by an otherworldly glow. Approaching it, the steps of a staircase materialized along the wall, spiraling upward into mist. The walls of the tower bore impressions of forms that seemed like memories pressed into the stone, hand-shaped, foot-shaped, and shapes impossible to identify. Shadows and light moved across these surfaces, casting patterns that shifted subtly as perspective changed. The air within the tower was thick, carrying a hum that resonated through the chest, a vibration that seemed to connect observer and building. Each step upward felt deliberate, each breath synchronized to the rhythm of the city, each glance affecting the subtle interactions that defined the space. At the top of the tower, a circular platform opened to the sky, clouds swirling unnaturally above. Floating lights drifted across the open air, pulsing slowly in harmony with the hum of the city. Reflections in puddles and windows below revealed streets and buildings that existed nowhere else, loops and patterns that challenged comprehension. The city, vast and empty, was aware. Shadows shifted, objects moved imperceptibly, staircases appeared and disappeared, doors opened and closed, all in subtle, coordinated motion. The hum reached a gentle crescendo, then softened, a reminder that the city was patient, timeless, aware, and calm despite its eerie, shifting nature. The observer felt simultaneously present and insignificant, guided and observed, immersed in a world that was alive with absence yet completely coherent. From the tower, it became clear that the abandoned city was a network of spaces that operated on perception and attention. Each street, alley, and building interacted with presence, forming paths that bent reality, light that responded to focus, shadows that moved independently. Doors led to spaces that were impossible, reflections revealed alternative geometries, and floating lights guided exploration subtly while teasing the observer's curiosity. The city was alive in rhythm, in memory, in pulse, in vibration. There was no danger, only awe and tension, the thrill of exploration, the hypnotic uncertainty of what might appear or disappear at any moment. The streets led back eventually to the central square. The mist had thinned slightly, and the floating lights hovered lazily. Doors opened wider, inviting observation, but nothing aggressive emerged. The abandoned city allowed exploration, but demanded attention, patience, and focus. Every movement, glance, and breath was part of the interaction, a silent negotiation between observer and environment. The city's presence was undeniable, immense yet subtle, alive without motion, breathing without sound. Shadows danced, reflections lagged, objects shifted, stairs formed and vanished, doors appeared and closed, lights pulsed. All was quiet yet alert, a living architecture that existed beyond ordinary perception. Eventually, a single main avenue became visible, leading toward the edge of the city. The streets stretched and shifted subtly as steps were taken. The observer noticed that with each step, the hum softened, the shadows moved more predictably, and the lights drifted slower. The city seemed to guide outward, toward a place where presence would exit but memory would remain. Buildings aligned along the avenue, doors ceased to open spontaneously, staircases vanished, objects rested quietly. The abandoned city exhaled, releasing awareness without losing presence, as though it had remembered and acknowledged the visit. Stepping onto the road that led beyond the city, the observer felt a calm tension linger in the air, a sense that the city was still aware, still watching, yet content. The city remained behind, vast and silent. Buildings leaned gently toward each other, windows dark and still, doors resting slightly ajar. Shadows remained, but slower, stretching faintly toward the edges of streets. The hum became imperceptible, but the pulse could still be felt beneath the surface, a subtle vibration in memory and atmosphere. The fog lingered at the edges, curling softly along the pavement. Even from a distance, the observer knew the city had been alive, had interacted, had guided and observed, and would continue to exist in that state, waiting for the next visitor, patient, aware, calm. The abandoned city had revealed its rhythm, its memory, its presence, and its quiet intelligence, a living, breathing entity of empty streets, dark windows, and endless possibility.